So I definitely recommend doing that. Hi guys, it's Eva, and in this episode I'll show you 5 techniques to use on old tonal one-shots you have to make them into new patches and give them a new life within Faceplant. So I've been really enjoying these techniques because I have a ton of samples and I tend to only use a small portion of those. I'll highly encourage you to take some of those samples, find them on your hard drive, and follow along to create some new patches. So let's check it out. The first technique we're gonna look at is gonna give us some kind of vintage synth feel. We're gonna start with the same sample we've seen before in the first episode. It's just me tapping on a crystal glass. Pretty interesting, but I wanted to have a bit more sustain, to have more to work with if we're making some patches. So the thing I'm gonna do is pull up Snap Heap. I removed some of the attack, compressed it a bit, filtered it lightly, gave it some sustain by adding a long reverb tail, and modulated that sustain slightly with a really slow chorus and flanger. Here's that sound now. We're going to export that sample and then import it into Faceplant, so let's check that out. I introduced the sampler with the sample we just bounced. I filtered it a bit and added some distortion. I then tweaked an envelope to move in more slowly. Here's what that sounds like. The most important thing for this patch is to use the unison modes. We're going to look at some creative unison modes that are really versatile. Once we use that, it's going to sound something like this. It's going to make a lot of sense to check the different modes and just see what kind of options you have, because those unison modes can drastically change the way your sample sounds. So here I use frequency stack, and I also added some global unison, some filtering, and some nonlinear filtering for some characters. So here's that sound. That's really cool to me because just within a couple of steps and using some unison modes, we went from that really basic sound to an exciting synth patch. The next technique is pretty closely related to the first patch, and it's about loop modes in the sampler. We have the same patch as before, and the only thing that changed is I tweaked the offset to not have the harsh attack from before. I introduced some loop points that are making the sound more dreamy, and I modulated those with an envelope and modulated that envelope again with an LFO to give some interesting movement. Those are time sync. So once we have that, I added some gain because it's pretty quiet, and I added a phaser to make it fall into place more. So here's that sound. This could be really interesting as a texture behind another pad or just for some harmonic ambience. The speed of the modulation can be as slow and as fast as you want it. So if I remove this LFO, it's just synced to 1 bar, then it's going to be way slower. There's no dedicated granular mode in Faceplant, but there's a really cool workaround that I wanted to show you today because it adds a lot of versatility. We're going to start by importing the sampler, tweak the attack time to just fit the sample properly. It's going to sound like this. Once we have that sample, we're going to add a loop point with a really small length. So we have a really grainy part of it that's being repeated. So let's hear that. To not have that be super repetitive and to integrate some movement, we're going to modulate the start point. To be a bit more interesting stereo-wise, we're going to duplicate the output and send one to lane 1 and the other one to lane 2. We're going to have lane 1 and lane 2 being separate processing buses and it all being sumped in lane 3. We're going to pan hard left and right. To not only have one sound, we're going to duplicate this whole group by holding Alt and dragging, and then we're going to inverse the panning here, tweak the start point a tiny bit just so we have a bit of different tonalities. Here's that. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to set up the lanes. I want lane 1 to be a reverse portion of the signal. Lane 2 is going to add some pitch shifted signals. So we have an octave up and an octave down with the grain size being modulated by a random LFO. We're modulating both grain sizes just to give us a bit more movement and unpredictability. And we added a ping pong delay and modulated the stereo field. So all of that is being summed into a reverb that gives us our final sound. Let's check it out. Moving away from the sampler, there's a ton of options too. First thing we're gonna check out is how to create a wavetable from your sample. We're gonna add a wavetable, edit it, go to File, Create from Sample, and select the sample we want. Then we're gonna tweak start and end points. I'm just gonna press this, move this a tiny bit, and I make the end a bit earlier. I know this is an A4, so we're gonna make sure it's tuned properly. I'm gonna press done and also normalize global peaks just so it's a bit louder. So what we could do is we could distort this a bit. If we want, we can also draw in some harmonics, we could filter it, apply some effects. We could do a ton of stuff, and we could also just save it under a name that makes sense to us. So this is gonna be the bell wavetable. Once we start adding some effects to that, it can be really interesting. So here I have the same one, filtered it a bit more, and I have some reverser and reverb going that's being modulated. It's super quick to create your own custom wavetable, so I definitely recommend doing that. Even using them as a layer in your sound can be really interesting. There's so many wavetables that come with Faceplant, but it can be exciting to create your own and just tweak the sound in ways that make sense. The last thing I wanted to show you is to use Convolver for some of your samples. So this is not just tonal samples. Mostly with rhythmic stuff or just small percussive things, it can be really interesting. Here's the bell patch from before. I imported a small portion of a sound that's a bit percussive. Let's hear what that does to the sound. This is a sound normally. So if you have some Foley sound recordings lying around or just some tiny snippets of sound, I definitely advise you to import them in Convolver. And even if you have long sounds like Atmos samples or tonal stuff, definitely import them and just see what happens. Here I used a long Atmos sample. I needed to up the gain a lot because the sample is pretty quiet. If you use tonal stuff, just make sure to use a limiter because it can get a bit crazy. Make a custom folder for some of your sounds you're not using for Convolver. Just use them in here and just try out a couple things and maybe you'll get some presets that you really love. Here's a really long Atmos sample and it almost gives the sound a drony type of character, which I did not expect. So it's also just about throwing in some samples and seeing what happens. So here's that sound. By using samples, fading them in and stretching them, you can get some kind of riser effects, which is really cool because this is just an Atmos sample of recording some surroundings, maybe some street noise and stuff like that. The longer your samples are, the longer the sound is going to continue. Thanks so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this series. I loved making it and I loved using some of my old samples and putting them to good use again. I'd love to know some of your go-to ways to use some old samples in your work, so make sure to put that in a comment, subscribe to Kilohearts, and until next time.